The monitor screamed first. Then the room screamed with it. A boy lay on the trauma bed under white light so hard it erased shadows, his chest rising in short, wrong movements, his lips going the color of ash. Around him, 6 people in scrubs moved with the practiced urgency of a team that had done this 100 times before and still hated every second of it. A nurse called out numbers. A resident's hands shook just slightly over the boy's sternum. And in the doorway, mop bucket forgotten behind him, stood a black man in gray janitorial coveralls who had not been asked a single question and who nobody in that room had looked at twice. He had seen this exact collapse before. Not in this hospital. Not in this life. He's crashing, someone said. We're losing him. The man in the coveralls took one step into the room, and a voice cut across the chaos like a blade. "Sir, this is a restricted area. You need to leave. Now." He did not leave. What happened in the next 4 minutes would be talked about in that hospital for years, would end one woman's certainty about exactly who deserved to be believed, and would prove that the most dangerous thing you can do to a room full of frightened people is assume you already know who's capable of saving it. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who mistook your silence for your limits, this one is for you. Stay with us. Marcus Bell had a system for Tuesday nights, and it never changed. He clocked in at St. Augustine Medical Center at 6:45, pushed his cart out of the supply closet by 7, and worked the East Wing first because the East Wing filled up fastest and emptied out slowest. And a man who understood flow understood that you cleared the hard ground before the easy ground got harder. He picked his son Jordan up from the after-school program at 6:15 sharp because Denise, the woman 2 floors down in HR who watched him 3 nights a week, had a hard stop at 6:30, and Marcus had never once been late for anything that mattered to someone else. Jordan did his homework in the break room on the 2nd floor, at the corner table by the vending machine, under a laminated sign that said employees only that nobody had ever enforced against an 8-year-old with a math worksheet and a juice box. It was not a glamorous life, mop water, fluorescent hum, a paycheck that required careful math of its own. But it was steady, and Marcus had learned the hard way that steady was worth more than most people gave it credit for. He was 43 years old, broad through the shoulders in a way the gray coveralls didn't quite hide, with a face that had learned, a long time ago, how to stay perfectly neutral in rooms where people had already decided who he was before he opened his mouth. There was a small white scar along the inside of his left forearm, thin as thread, the kind of mark you'd only notice if you were looking for it, and a habit, unconscious, automatic, of positioning himself in any room so that he could see the door. Nobody at St. Augustine asked about either one. He had been there 14 months, said please and thank you to everyone from the parking attendant to the chief of surgery, and had become in the particular way invisible people become fixtures. Someone the hospital simply ran around rather than with. Jordan was 7 going on 40, serious-eyed, quick with a joke he'd deliver completely deadpan and then wait, unblinking, for the room to catch up. He had his mother's hands and his father's stillness, and he carried a small dinosaur keychain everywhere, a triceratops missing one horn, that he'd clip and unclip from his backpack zipper when he was thinking hard about something. Marcus had raised him alone for 3 years now, ever since the accident that neither of them talked about on nights like this one, and he had built the boy's whole world out of routines precisely because routines were the one thing grief couldn't touch. Homework at 6:15, dinner from the vending machine, or, on good nights, something Marcus had packed. Lights out by 9, whether they were home or, as happened more often than either of them liked, still in a break room 2 floors above a hospital's beating, exhausted heart. What none of Jordan's teachers knew, what none of the hospital's HR paperwork recorded beyond a line that read prior military service, honorable discharge, was that the man pushing the mop cart down the East Wing corridor had once held human lives together with his bare hands in conditions no fluorescent-lit hallway could prepare a person for. Marcus never spoke of it, not because it was a secret exactly, but because he had learned that some kinds of knowledge, once you set them down in a room, changed the weight of everything around them, and he had wanted, more than almost anything else in the world, 4 years now, to simply be a man who mopped floors and picked his son up on time. St. Augustine's emergency department ran on its own gravity, and Marcus had come to understand its currents the way a man learns a river he crosses every day without ever swimming in it. The trauma bay was the deepest part, the place where the current pulled hardest, and everyone who worked there moved with a particular controlled tension, the look of people perpetually bracing for the doors to open on something worse than what they'd just survived. He cleaned around them at a respectful distance, restocked supply carts before dawn shifts needed them, wiped down waiting room chairs that strangers filled and emptied in an endless quiet churn of worry. Nobody in scrubs looked directly at him for longer than it took to step around his cart. That was fine. He had built a life on the specific freedom of being unseen. Dr. Vanessa Cole ran the trauma bay the way some people run companies, with total, unblinking confidence in her own read of a room. She was 38, sharp-featured, immaculate even at hour 11 of a double shift, the kind of attending physician residents both feared and privately imitated because her instincts were, more often than not, correct. She had trained at 2 of the best programs in the country, had the framed certificates in her office to prove it, and had never once in 11 years of practice encountered a situation in the trauma bay that her training hadn't eventually solved. That confidence had saved lives. It had also made her, without her ever quite noticing, a woman who stopped listening to anyone whose credentials she couldn't immediately see. Marcus had watched her walk past him in these halls 100 times without her eyes registering him as anything more than a piece of the building's furniture, doing its job so she didn't have to think about it. The hospital had its own rhythm, and Marcus had come to know it the way a man knows the tide tables of a coast he walks every day. Shift changes at 7 and 7. The particular hush that settled over the corridors between 2 and 4 in the morning, when even the sickest wings seemed to hold their breath. The smell of industrial disinfectant layered under old coffee and, underneath that, always, the faint chemical sharpness of fear that no amount of cleaning ever fully lifted out of a waiting room. He knew which elevator ran slow, which vending machine swallowed dollar bills without releasing anything in return, which nurses said good morning to him by name, and which ones looked through him as though his cart moved itself down the hall. He had catalogued all of it without bitterness, out of the same old habit that had once made him good at far more dangerous work, the habit of knowing exactly where he stood in a room before that room ever asked anything of him. Tuesday night, the ambulance bay doors slammed open at 9:47, and everything in the department reorganized itself around a single gurney. The boy was 10 years old, struck by a car 3 blocks from the hospital, walking home from a friend's house with his backpack still slung over one shoulder when it happened. The paramedics were calling out vitals before the gurney cleared the doors, blood pressure dropping, breath sounds unequal, the particular controlled urgency of people who had done everything right and were still losing ground. Dr. Cole met them at the doors and took the case the way she took every case, moving fast, calling orders, her voice cutting cleanly through the noise. Marcus was 2 rooms down, restocking gauze, when the boy came through, and something in him went very still. An old, dormant alertness surfacing before conscious thought caught up to it. By the time he reached the doorway of Trauma 2, drawn there by an instinct he hadn't fully named yet, the boy's oxygen was falling, and nobody in the room had caught why. Breath sounds absent on the left, a nurse said, and Dr. Cole's head came up sharply. Pneumothorax, probably, prep for a chest tube, BP's dropping faster than a simple pneumo, the resident said, voice tight. 90/40 and falling. Marcus stood in the doorway with his mop bucket forgotten behind him, watching the monitor, watching the particular gray creeping into the boy's lips, and felt something in his chest lock into a shape he hadn't used in 4 years. He had seen this exact collapse before, the mismatch between what the equipment was reporting and what the patient's body was actually telling you. The kind of gap that, in the field, had cost him people he still thought about at 3 in the morning. He knew, with a certainty that arrived whole and complete rather than reasoned out step by step, that they were treating the wrong problem, and that the boy had perhaps 2 minutes before the wrong problem became the only problem that mattered. He stepped into the room. "Sir, this is a restricted area." Dr. Cole didn't even look at him fully. A half-glance, dismissive, the reflexive irritation of someone whose focus had been interrupted by something she'd already categorized as unimportant. "You need to step out, now." "His neck veins are distended," Marcus said. His voice was quiet even, the voice of a man reporting a fact rather than making a claim. "And his trachea's shifted. That's not a simple pneumothorax. That's tension. You need to decompress the chest before that tube goes in, or you're going to lose his heart before you ever reach his lung." The room did not stop, exactly. There wasn't time for it to stop. But something in it flickered. A half-second of attention diverted from the boy to the man in the gray coveralls who had just spoken with the specific cadence of someone who knew precisely what he was talking about. Dr. Cole turned fully now, and what crossed her face was not curiosity. It was something closer to offense. "I need you to leave this room immediately," she said, each word placed with precision. "This is a critical patient and I do not have time to explain hospital procedure to custodial staff." "I'm not asking you to explain anything," Marcus said. "I'm telling you what I'm seeing. Jugular distension, tracheal deviation, hypotension that's outpacing a simple pneumo. That's a tension pneumothorax. It's going to arrest his heart in under 2 minutes if it isn't relieved." A young resident near the head of the bed glanced up, something uncertain moving behind her eyes. The specific discomfort of a person low enough in the hierarchy to notice a good idea but not high enough to be the one who said it out loud. A nurse near the supply cart had gone still too, her hand hovering over a stack of gauze she no longer seemed to remember reaching for, her eyes moving between the monitor and the man in the doorway with the particular arithmetic of someone doing the math on her own and not liking where it landed. Nobody said anything. In a room built for speed, the silence that followed Marcus's words lasted only a second or two, but it was the kind of silence that a handful of people in that room would still be thinking about months later, long after the shift had ended and the story had already begun traveling the halls on its own. Dr. Cole caught the glance and it seemed to harden something in her further, the way authority sometimes hardens fastest exactly when it senses itself being quietly questioned. "I've been doing this for 11 years, she said, not raising her voice, which somehow made it worse. "I don't need a janitor telling me how to run my trauma bay. Security, get him out of here." Marcus did not raise his voice either. He did not stagger, did not flinch, did not do any of the things a man does when he's been humiliated in front of a room full of strangers. He simply held his ground exactly where he was and said, "I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm trying to keep that boy alive long enough for you to save him. You have less than 2 minutes. Get him out," Dr. Cole said again, sharper now, and 2 security guards who had been drawn by the raised voices moved into the doorway behind Marcus, their presence changing the geometry of the room the way it always did. 2 large men positioning themselves as though the janitor were the emergency rather than the boy on the table whose oxygen numbers were sliding past 90, past 85, past a threshold that made the machine begin its own high, insistent alarm. At the second-floor break room, 2 floors above all of this, Jordan sat with his math worksheet half finished and his Triceratops keychain in his hand, unclipping and reclipping it in the slow, repetitive rhythm he used when something felt wrong in a way he couldn't name. He didn't know what was happening below him. He only knew, with the particular unexplainable certainty children sometimes carry about the people they love, that his father's night had just changed shape. "You don't know anything about what's happening in this room," Dr. Cole said. And there was real anger in it now, the specific anger of a person who feels control slipping and mistakes the feeling for disrespect. "You mop floors. You don't get to stand there and tell me how to treat a dying child." "I'm not telling you how to treat him," Marcus said. "I'm telling you what his body is doing right now, in front of both of us, whether either of us wants to argue about it or not. The monitor isn't going to wait for you to decide whether I've earned the right to say it." A security guard's hand closed around Marcus's upper arm. "Sir, we need you to come with us." Marcus did not pull away. He turned his head, not toward the guard, but toward the monitor, toward the boy, toward the flat, plummeting line of a number that meant, in the very specific mathematics of trauma medicine, that a 10-year-old was somewhere between 60 and 90 seconds from a heart that would not beat anymore. "You have a syringe kit in that cart by the door," Marcus said, his voice still level, still without a trace of panic, directed now not at Dr. Cole but at the room itself, at anyone in it who might be listening past their certainty. "Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. If nobody in this room is willing to do it in the next 30 seconds, that boy is going to code, and every one of you is going to spend the rest of your life wondering why you didn't just try." "That's enough," Dr. Cole snapped. "Remove him." The guards began to pull him backward through the doorway. Marcus did not resist, did not thrash, did not raise his hands, did not do anything that could be described later as aggression, but he did not stop speaking either, his voice carrying clean and calm across the noise of the alarm and the rising panic in the room. "Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. He does not have time for you to be right about who I am before you're right about what's wrong with him." The monitor's alarm changed pitch. The specific rising shriek that every person in that room had been trained, at some point in their career, to recognize as the sound of a heart preparing to stop. Dr. Cole's hand hovered over the boy's chest for one full second, caught between 11 years of training that told her the janitor in her doorway had no business speaking in her trauma bay, and something colder and more urgent underneath that training. The plain fact that the numbers on the monitor agreed with everything the strange, calm man in the coveralls had just said. It was the resident who moved first. Dr. Patterson, 3 years out of her program, young enough that her instincts hadn't yet fully hardened into certainty, grabbed the decompression kit from the cart without waiting for permission and looked at Dr. Cole with an expression that asked a single wordless question. "Are we doing this or not?" "Do it," Dr. Cole said, and the words came out of her like something forced through a narrow space, reluctant and immediate at the same time. The guards, still holding Marcus's arms, paused in the doorway, caught, all three of them, in the strange suspended moment where authority and the need to see what happened next pulled a person in opposite directions. The needle went in. There was a sound, a short hiss of pressure releasing, air escaping a space it should never have gathered in. And the change in the boy's chest was almost immediate, his color shifting from ash gray toward something with blood still moving through it, his oxygen number climbing on the monitor in small, then larger increments. The alarm's pitch fell. Somewhere in the room someone exhaled a breath they had clearly been holding since the doors first opened. "BP's coming up," Dr. Patterson said, and her voice cracked slightly on the words, relief breaking through professional composure. 98 over 60. Sat's climbing. He's stabilizing. Nobody moved for a moment. That was the thing everyone in the room would remember later. The sheer stillness that followed. The way the guards' hands loosened around Marcus's arms without either of them quite deciding to let go. The way Dr. Cole stood over the boy's bed with her own hands still slightly raised from the procedure she had, at the last possible second, allowed someone else to talk her into. "How?" Dr. Cole said. She wasn't looking at the boy anymore. She was looking at Marcus, and her voice had lost the sharp edge it carried a minute earlier, replaced by something rawer and more uncertain. "How did you know that?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked at the boy first, at the small chest rising now in a rhythm that made sense, at the color returning to lips that had gone the color of ash, and something in his own shoulders came down a fraction of an inch, the specific release of a man who had just watched a version of a memory rewrite itself into something survivable. "Because I've seen it before," he said finally. "More times than I wanted to." The guards let go of his arms entirely now, stepping back with the particular awkwardness of men who had just realized they'd been holding the wrong person. It was at that moment that the trauma bay doors opened again, and a tall, silver-haired man in a white coat crossed the threshold with the unhurried authority of someone who did not need to rush because rooms simply organized themselves around his arrival. Dr. Elias Whitfield, chief of surgery, had been paged 20 minutes earlier for an unrelated consult 2 floors up and had heard, on his way down, a fragment of a story moving through the hospital's grapevine at the particular speed that only true stories seem to travel. Something about a janitor in the trauma bay, A needle, a boy who shouldn't have made it. He stopped just inside the doorway. He looked at the boy on the table, stabilizing, his numbers climbing steadily toward something safe. He looked at Dr. Cole, who was still standing with an expression she had never worn in front of her staff before. And then his eyes moved to the man in the gray coveralls, standing quietly near the door, and something in Dr. Whitfield's face changed entirely. The slow, dawning recognition of a man looking at someone he had not seen in a very long time and had never expected to find again in a place like this. "Bell," he said, and the single word landed in the room with a specific, unmistakable weight. Marcus Bell. Marcus looked at him, and for the first time since he'd walked into that trauma bay, something shifted behind his own carefully neutral expression. The particular vulnerability of a man whose past had just found him standing exactly where he hadn't meant to be found. "It's been a long time, sir," Marcus said quietly. Dr. Cole looked between the two men, and confusion moved visibly across her face. "You two know each other? Know him?" Dr. Whitfield said, and there was something almost disbelieving in his voice now, the sound of a man recalibrating an entire evening in real time. "Dr. Marcus Bell was the best combat trauma surgeon I ever served alongside. 2 tours, forward surgical team, the kind of surgeon other surgeons talked about for years after they rotated out. I lost track of him after his discharge." He turned to look at Marcus fully now. "I heard you'd left medicine. I didn't know you'd—" He stopped, glancing at the mop bucket still sitting forgotten by the doorway, and something in his expression softened into an understanding too large and too personal to say out loud in a room full of people. Dr. Cole's hand had come up to cover her mouth, just slightly, an involuntary gesture. You're a surgeon." "I was," Marcus said. His voice was steady, but there was a rawness underneath it now that hadn't been there a minute earlier. "I'm not anymore. I walked away 4 years ago. There was a case I lost that I couldn't—" He stopped himself, the sentence unfinished, the way certain sentences stay unfinished for the rest of a person's life. "I took this job because I needed to be somewhere I could still help without it costing what it used to cost me. Nobody here needed to know the rest of it." The room held that for a long moment. Nurses, residents, the 2 security guards who had, 10 minutes earlier, been physically removing this man from a trauma bay he had just saved a child's life inside of. Dr. Cole was the one who finally broke the silence, and when she did, her voice carried none of the sharpness it had held before, only something quieter and considerably harder to say. "I told you to leave," she said, looking directly at Marcus now. "I called security on you. I told you that you didn't have any business speaking in my trauma bay, and you were right, and I was so certain of what I thought I already knew about you that I almost let that boy die because of it." She glanced at the bed, at the boy whose numbers continued climbing steadily toward safety, and something in her composure finally visibly cracked. "I need you to know I understand exactly what I almost did tonight." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He did not gloat. He did not offer easy forgiveness either, because that wasn't his to give, and he knew it. "You made the call in the end," he said simply. "That's the part that matters. A lot of people wouldn't have, even with the numbers staring them in the face. You did. Because you didn't stop talking," Dr. Cole said. "Even while they were dragging you out of the room, you didn't stop telling us what to do. If you had—" She didn't finish that sentence either. "I wasn't going to let a boy die over whether you believed I had the right to speak," Marcus said. "That was never going to be a fair trade." Dr. Patterson, still standing near the bed with the decompression kit's empty packaging in her gloved hand, looked at Dr. Cole and then at Marcus with something like awe still moving across her young face. "He's stable," she said quietly. "Vitals are holding. We need to get him up to imaging, but he's going to make it. He's going to be okay." Word moved through St. Augustine the way it always does in hospitals, fast and mostly true, gathering small distortions as it traveled from nurse to nurse, floor to floor. By the time Marcus made it upstairs to collect Jordan from the break room, 3 different people had already stopped him in the hallway to say some version of thank you, and one nurse from the 2nd floor, who had heard only the broad strokes, simply gripped his forearm for a second and said nothing at all, which said everything. Jordan was exactly where Marcus had left him. Triceratops keychain in hand, math worksheet finished and folded into careful quarters the way he always folded things when he was done with them. He looked up when his father came through the door, and something in his face, that old, quiet perceptiveness he'd carried since he was small, read the evening off his father's expression before a single word passed between them. "Dad?" Jordan said, sliding off his chair. "Are you okay?" Marcus crossed the room and crouched down to his son's height, the way he always did for conversations that mattered, and put both hands lightly on the boy's shoulders. "I'm okay, buddy," he said. "There was a little boy downstairs who got hurt tonight. I helped take care of him." Jordan considered this with the careful seriousness he brought to everything. "Like the way you used to help people before." Marcus went still for a second, surprised, the way a parent is always faintly surprised to discover how much a child has absorbed without ever being told directly. "Yeah," he said finally, "exactly like that." "Is that a good thing or a sad thing?" Jordan asked, tilting his head, the Triceratops turning slowly in his small fingers. Marcus thought about the question the way it deserved to be thought about. The way he thought about everything Jordan asked him, because he had promised himself a long time ago that he would never give his son an easy answer just because it was easier to give. "Both, sometimes," he said. "You can be sad about a thing you lost and still be glad you got to use it again for somebody who needed it. Those aren't opposites. They just live in the same place." Jordan nodded slowly, filing this away the way he filed away most of what his father told him, permanently, without needing to ask twice. Then he reached up and took his father's hand, small fingers wrapping around 3 of Marcus's, and together they walked out of the break room and down the hallway toward the elevator, past nurses who watched them go with an expression none of them quite had words for yet. Dr. Whitfield found Marcus in the parking garage 20 minutes later, jacket over his coveralls. Jordan already buckled into the back seat of the old truck with his backpack in his lap. The chief of surgery walked up slowly, hands in his coat pockets, and stood for a moment without saying anything, the 2 men taking each other in properly for the first time in 4 years. "I'm not here to talk you into anything," Dr. Whitfield said finally. "I know better than that. I just wanted you to know the offer exists whenever you're ready for it, however long that takes. This hospital would be lucky to have you back in a room where that training actually gets used the way it deserves to be." Marcus looked at him for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that wasn't quite decision yet, but wasn't refusal either. "I appreciate that," he said. "I'm not there yet, but I'm not as far from it as I was yesterday." Dr. Whitfield nodded, accepting that for exactly what it was, and extended his hand. Marcus shook it. 3 weeks later, Dr. Vanessa Cole found Marcus in the East Wing supply closet before his shift, restocking gauze the same way he had 100 nights before. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she spoke, and when she did, her voice carried none of the sharp certainty it had once carried by default. "I've been thinking about that night a lot," she said, "about how close I came to being the reason that boy didn't make it home. Not because I made a bad medical call, because I made a bad call about a person before I ever let him finish a sentence." She paused. "I put in a formal request that we start a trauma consult stipend for staff with prior clinical experience, whatever their current role here is. It's not much, but I didn't want what happened in that room to just quietly become a hallway story that everybody forgets in a month." Marcus set down the box of gauze and looked at her. Not with triumph, not with the satisfaction of a man who had been vindicated, just with the same quiet attention he'd given her in the trauma bay 3 weeks earlier. "That's a good thing to do," he said. "Doesn't erase what almost happened. But it's a good thing to do anyway." "I know it doesn't erase it," Dr. Cole said. "I'm not looking to erase it. I just don't want to be the same doctor I was walking into that room." Marcus nodded once, the same unhurried, unceremonious nod he gave to most things that mattered, and went back to his shift. The boy, his name was Theo, Marcus learned later, 10 years old, a Saturday soccer player with 2 younger sisters who had cried in the waiting room for 4 straight hours, was discharged 12 days later, walking out of St. Augustine on his own legs with his parents on either side of him and a hospital-issued balloon tied to his wrist that he clearly considered beneath his dignity but tolerated anyway. His mother asked, before they left, if she could meet the man who had helped save her son. Marcus was 2 floors up at the time, mopping a corridor that didn't need him to be a surgeon for anyone to see what he was worth. And when he came down to meet them, Theo's mother didn't say anything for a long moment. She just took both of his hands in both of hers and held on. "They told me you almost got thrown out of the room," she said finally. "I did get thrown out of the room," Marcus said, "for about 4 seconds. And you kept talking anyway." "He needed somebody to," Marcus said simply. That was the only explanation he ever gave anyone. And it turned out, in the end, to be the only one that mattered. In the weeks that followed, small things changed at St. Augustine that nobody wrote a memo about. Nurses who had never learned the names of the custodial staff started learning them. A resident, on a slow Thursday afternoon, asked Marcus what he thought about a patient's breathing pattern before she paged the attending, and stood there patiently waiting for his answer, as though it mattered. Because by then, everyone in that department understood that it did. Jordan started coming down to the first floor sometimes after his homework was done, sitting quietly in the corner of the break room with his Triceratops keychain, watching his father move through the halls with a kind of settled pride he hadn't quite had words for before that Tuesday night, but understood completely now. A hospital does not run on the people whose names are on the doors. It runs, in the end, on the people who show up in the smallest hours doing the smallest jobs, watching everything, ready, even when nobody expects it of them, even when nobody has bothered to ask, to give everything they have the moment it's needed. Somebody's worth was never really about the coveralls or the coat. It was about what a person was willing to do for a stranger when the room had already decided they had nothing to offer. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and if you haven't already, subscribe. There are more stories like this one coming.